Okay, wonderful. So I am C.N.E Corbin. I am currently an assistant professor at Portland State University, but I have been in Oakland since 2004. I served on the Oakland Parks and Recreation Advisory Commission from 2015 to 2020, and I was a board member for the Oakland Parks and Recreation Foundation. My research actually looks at Oakland from redlining to greenlining. And so I'm going to touch on housing again, but I'm going to bring in an environmental justice lens to it. So I graduated Berkeley in 2020 in environmental science policy and management, and I have my undergraduate degree at Berkeley in African American studies and media studies. And so Oakland has been very informative and very much I look at Oakland and the work that I do as a type of radical love and giving back to the community that has given so much to me. So I'm going to go ahead and start my talk. And so the first thing I want to ground is the understanding around environmental justice. And there's two sides to it. It's the uneven distribution of environmental harms and the uneven development of environmental goods in which low-income residents in communities of color, particularly Black residents, are disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards while also being prevented from benefiting from environmental amenities. And so I'm going to go over a history of Oakland, which I found 3 eras. And I call these eras red, black, and green. So red, when Oakland was a legally segregated city. Black from 1977 to 1999 when Oakland was a chocolate city. And then I'm going to go into when Oakland starts adopting environmental policies, in which I call it the green city. So let's first start with red. And we touched on this a little bit, but this might be a very helpful image to look at. And so that demarcated box is that era of red. And what you see is the overall population of Oakland in orange, the white population in yellow, and then you see the African American or Black population here in blue. And what this shows, is particularly around here, is the increase of the Black community coming from the South to the West, what we consider the second migration of African Americans to the wartime industry. And they're not coming along alone from the South. Also white folks. And then you also see the white flight going out into the suburbs, or incentivized to go out into the suburbs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So what makes this particular era form in a particular way is the Homeowners Loan Corporation structure, the Federal Housing Administration loans, and legal race-based segregation. So you might have seen this before. This is a homeowners corporation or homeowner loan owners corporation map, and it's actually made up of area description documents. And Oakland has 69 tracts within their Hulk document. And so what I want to focus on is that these documents were produced by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board in cooperation with the local governments for over 200 cities. And this was part of Roosevelt's New Deal, which created the Homeowners Refinancing Act of 1933. And this is because of the stock market crash in 1929. And this was a way to quell the dispossession of homes because of the crisis. And so the Homeowner Loan Corporation provided security grades, and it's from A to D that has a color-coded response in green to red. And just to get into it a little bit, the red areas, or the green areas, I should start off, were considered to be the best neighborhoods. They were considered to be the pinnacle of what a city should be, followed by blue or B, second grade, which were still good. C were considered to be declining, and red were considered to be hazardous for investments, hence the term of redlining, which we talked about. So multiple factors influenced the Hulk conditions, and that includes housing stock, type of housing stock, racial demographics, and also what's really important is the surrounding environment. So when you look at West Oakland, this map is actually showing the bifurcation of Oakland into differently valued landscapes, with the hills predominant in green and blue. And then you also have the blue, the flats in mostly yellow and red. And this map actually indicates which neighborhoods and residents are worthy of investment and which are not. And for the purposes of this particular presentation, I'm just going to focus on the green and red area tracks. And so Oakland actually has 5 green tracks within the Hulk area description documents. And these neighborhoods are touted as good, inspiring, and or unsurpassed. With Claremont is considered one of the best residential areas in East Bay, and Montclair neighborhood is recorded as a beautiful sylvan setting amongst pine and eucalyptus trees, fine views. So you might already hear that some of these neighborhoods are still considered to be the best in Oakland today. And they were situated next to the 500-acre Joaquin Miller Park, which was acquired by Oakland in 1917, and Redwood Regional, which is about a 1,077-acre park. What was also done prior to the Hulk area description documents being made is that Oakland invested about $500,000 in the regional park, which would be equivalently to about $9.5 million today. And it was considered to be the finest recreation center in the United States of the time. And that's according to some Oakland history from 1942. And these areas were highly restricted, particularly highly racially restricted, with protective provisions against occupancies by Negroes, Blacks, and Oriental Asians. And what they also say is that because the Homeowners Loan Corporation, in conjunction with the Federal Housing Administration, these homes were actually cheaper than fair ordinary rent because of the incentives that the government was giving to a mostly white population. And so this is to speak to Oakland actually having a suburbs before the suburbanization process that we see in World War II. What they were also granted was the backyard, a private green space for their personal enjoyment and entertainment. And this is a very different understanding than what we see in the Oakland Flats. And already in the Oakland Flats, what's considered to be desirable or favorable influences is the housing stock being close to industry. And this is favorable for the laborers. So you start seeing the first indicators of environmental injustice in which folks of color are positioned next to factories, which is great for being able to work there, but they're also being exposed to environmental harms. And so you see this within the area description documents, right? They're touting as walking distance to local industry for laborers is a good thing, but we're also seeing odors from factories and the homes are being cheap. And then you see this, and D8 is actually in West Oakland, and it says, this community is already experiencing odors from Bay Flats, smoke and grime from railroad shops and local industry. And the city's taxes were too high in proportion to income and value. So you're seeing the both sides of environmental injustice in the Oakland Flats. What this also did, because of the devaluation of the flats in Oakland, it made it possible to reduce the land values, remove housing through eminent domain. And Dr. Summers did talk about this, about urban renewal, which allowed for the freeway system to come through and the Bay Area rapid transit system to come through, right? And actually raise homes in these areas. And so redlining upheld and solidified racial segregation. Housing practices created distinctive landscapes in differently valued neighborhoods and created the necessary conditions needed to devalue and disinvest in Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian neighborhoods, homes, and land ownership, and literally cleared the way for demolition. And this was infrastructure or technology for white suburban residents that became the beneficiary of the dispossession of Black and brown homes. And what we can also say is that the homeowner loan corporation, or these redlining maps and documents, you can see the neighborhood residential patterns staying pretty much static during this time. You can also see the legacy of the redlining in poverty, income inequality in these areas, the lack of tree canopy coverage, higher ambient temperatures, and diminished home values. And so what we can say is redlining actually captured, contained, and contaminated these communities for generations. Now, if we move to the next era Black, which is where we see the Fair Housing Act being passed, you're seeing the last vestiges of white flight out of Oakland. You start seeing the suburbanization and the outsourcing of jobs and the implementation of Prop 13, which changes the task structure around. And this is if you, again, looking at the overall population of Oakland in orange, and then you see, again, the white flight out of Oakland falling sharply. You see the increase of the African-American population. And this is where you see Oakland having a Black plurality, or what we call a chocolate city. So sorry about that. Right. And so when we start thinking about environmental issues, what we can think about as well is, how did the freeway system not only wrap around West Oakland, but also how is it impacting access to park spaces, which I'm pretty familiar with and how I center a lot of my work. So what you see in the 1970s is Oakland's formerly red line neighborhoods. What you see is a second wave of new parks coming in, and they're associated with freeway construction. And so all of the undeveloped land near the freeways actually become these new parks. But according to the Health Effects Institute panel, the exposure zone from a highway or major road is approximately 300 to 500 meters. And the Mayo Clinic has placed the highest pollution levels around 400 meters from a road and advises to avoid these kinds of areas when exercising. So if we're thinking about West Oakland, and Oakland has 13 parks located in the historical African-American district. Prior to 1989, 6 parks were located within the 500 meters of the Cypress Freeway, right? 3 of these parks, DeFemery, Raimondi Park, and Willow Park, existed prior to the freeway. But after this freeway construction, it actually caused more pollution within those park systems, right? And then you see Lowell Park, which was created after. So the 3 freeways that were, the free parks that were created after the freeway system is Lowell Park, Wade Johnson Park, and Poplar Park. While 6 of these parks were relieved from the freeway-based car emissions after the Loma Prieta earthquake. But what we also see is, and 3 parks were relieved. McClymonds Mini Park, DeFemery Park, and Wade Johnson Park was relieved from the freeway emissions after the Cypress Freeway fell. But what you see is all the other parks here marked in red are still within this hazardous air zone within West Oakland. And this is also true within Chinatown Flats. All of the parks are within this hazardous exposure zone to emit car emissions. And we also see this in East Oakland, with the parks, only 3 outside of this exposure zone: Clinton Square, Garfield Park, and Josie de la Cruz Park. So all of the formerly redlined areas, even though they got more green space, they weren't the same quality of what it was happening in the Oakland Hills. And this is particularly detrimental to East Oakland, that has a particularly park poor area and lacking in overall green spaces. Right. And so when we start thinking about environmental policy, 1992 rings really important to me with the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit Agenda 21, bringing cities online for the first time to mitigate some of the most environmental harms. And then you see Oakland start taking up this language in 1996 through the Oakland Resolution 72809, and then the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and then another Oakland resolution that aligns it with the UN to start looking at environmental concerns and environmental justice concerns in Oakland. And why I find that really important, and this is when Oakland was a chocolate city. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't think about the Black community as being really influenced by environment or environmentalism, and you're seeing the Black community actually moving forward with an environmental justice agenda. Let's talk about green. And so again, looking at housing in connection to green space, what we see is the Hope 6 project and the erosion of affordable housing. We also see the subprime mortgage scandal happening. We see sustainable development happening in green master plans. And then also during this time, we see the rise of condos and luxury apartment creations within Oakland. And getting back to environmental justice, it's super important to understand that one zip code is still the most potent predictor of an individual's health and well-being. And this is by Dr. Robert Bullard, considered the grandfather or father of environmental justice, or EJ. And again, just to think through the history of Oakland. So the red line map, and we see West Oakland here, right? And moving forward, this is a racial dot map from 2010. So looking at our last census records, and you see that the hills are still predominantly in white. You still see West Oakland mostly housing African-American folks. Chinatown is in red, and then East Oakland, you see mostly Latinx communities, along with majority African-Americans living there. All right. So what we're also seeing during this time from redlining to where we are today is the local unwanted land uses that are accruing within West Oakland. This includes refineries, waste disposal facilities and dumps, chemical facilities, incineration facilities, and power plants, right? And we see in June 2018 that the most disadvantaged communities are still in these formerly redlined areas, right? This legacy continues with us. They have the highest score of pollution, again, looking in West Oakland and East Oakland, these formerly redlined areas. The diesel parts per million are higher in this area, again, because of the freeways that were constructed in these formerly redlined areas. We also see where the waste generators are and the hazardous waste facilities are located in the formerly redlined areas, and particularly in West Oakland and East Oakland. And even the quality of our park systems can be seen within this, in which the lowest rating parks are also located in these formerly redlined areas in West Oakland and in East Oakland. Right. And so when we think about switching and moving forward in a just way, a lot of times you'll hear the concept of the green city, which is an urban area designed to advance sustainable goals, address climate change, improve quality of life, and minimize negative environmental impacts. And the promise of these parks is that it absorbs CO2 and pollutants in the air, reduces flooding and stormwater runoff, and mitigates urban heat island effect. But the parks also create spaces for recreation, food production, wildlife habitat formation, novel ecosystems creation, and social cultural productions and placemaking. And this is where we see at DeFemery Park, at Mosswood, as well as other parks where you see Black cultural events being one of those type of connectors, network connectors, in spite of gentrification, and creating those spaces for Black joy. And I want to talk about, we talked about redlining, and let's talk a little bit about greenlining, which comes in two parts. So the first part is the business practice of investing energy, products, and services in low income, minority, and disabled communities to increase the profits and expand the economic pie. And we've also heard greenlining as attracting financing from mainstream communities to the inner city. And then the second part is environmental. So large areas of land with a mix of uses that are in some combination of public and private ownership, but are managed specifically for public purposes as recreation, ecological preservation, and maintenance of scenic vistas. And we've seen this in Oakland. So if you know about Lake Merritt, they passed Measure DD and spent about $240 million plus to revitalize Lake Merritt, which is super important, right? And this is where it's located. And we probably also know that there's been some tensions between community members about appropriate park use and appropriate park activities. We also see the Brooklyn Basin project. Again, you see luxury housing and condos being coupled with new park spaces. That is that connection between public-private ventures within Oakland. But you see within the future projections of Oakland, you're not seeing a future Black community in these spaces. And this is in the formerly red-lined area there. We have the downtown specific plan where you're first starting to see actually Black Oaklanders being rendered into these future projections of Oakland's Green City, located there. And West Oakland specific plan, which almost completely left out its actual living Black Oakland residents for the future of Oakland, right? And then we have a new regional shoreline that's happening in West Oakland. It's very beautiful, and it's located here. So with these new green space creations, what we're also seeing is gentrification and displacement from both home and nature of the African-American communities and residents living in Oakland, as well as low-income community members. And you can see from these two timelines how 1992 becomes a very interesting year in which the Hope 6 program comes into play, where you start seeing the dismantling of public housing facilities, and you see the Choice Voucher 8 system come into play. During this time, you see Oakland bringing in its environmental agenda, starting with the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, Agenda 21, which Oakland absorbs into their own resolutions and their own policies. You start seeing the mass evictions when Oakland is signing on to the Urban Environmental Accords. We start seeing rent increases as all of these revitalization projects starts happening. And you see luxury condos and development happening. And so what you're seeing is the erosion of affordable homes happening during the increase of Oakland greening and the switching over to luxury homes and condos at this time. So you're seeing the privatization of rental units becoming condos and completely pulling the rug out of affordable housing in Oakland at the same time that it's implementing a greening agenda. And what you see, again, is the increase of population for the first time in Oakland. You see all the other races being increased in Oakland as Oakland becomes more green. But what you see is the African-American population being reduced in each time. So I kind of want to bring this into a visual continuous sort of vicious cycle that we're seeing in Oakland through these eras. So you see the use of eminent domain to remove Black Oaklanders for the creation of the freeway system, for them to get subpar parks in the surplus land that's left after the creation of the freeway system. And then you see the erosion of Black homes, again, through the Hope 6 project, in which people are being moved out of facilities and into Voucher 8 programs, not necessarily staying in Oakland, but actually being moved out into Oakland, into the suburbs to get some of these vouchers. And then you see for the creation of Oakland as a green city, you see the subprime mortgage scandal and the erosion of the further erosion of affordable homes for the creation of these green master plans and these condos and luxury apartments that accompany them. While all this is dystopic, I think I want to take this time, because this is what allows me to continue to do this work, is to think through Afrofuturism. And Afrofuturism combines elements of science fiction, historical fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy, Afrocentricity, and magic realism with non-Western beliefs. In some cases, it's a total revision of the past, speculation about the future with cultural critiques. And I'm really hoping that we can take this journey. And I have been moving forward with this concept of EJ futurism. And this is the idea of visionary speculation grounded in environmental justice, which serves as a framework to reimagine, re-envision, and recreate socially just societies. Part of this is we need to unthink some of the Eurocentrism, but also unthink a lot of the dystopic histories that we have unfortunately been forced to live through. And what I want us to think about is that pivot from the fight against environmental dystopias to an intentional move towards creating practical environmental utopias. So what are we going to be fighting for versus against? What does that look like? And then also understanding that this is underpinned by decolonization, critical race theory, and feminist/womanist theory. And then also thinking about wrestling with the possibilities of environmentally and socially just futures that opens up the potential for socially just cultural productions in these spaces, grounded in understandings of sovereignty and self-determination. And I will conclude with this picture of Wakanda, which we can actually say is the first Black green city depicted on the screen. And I think we can use this to steer and stir our visions of what that means for Oakland in the future. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wow, just wow. Dr. Corbin, thank you for that presentation. And I just have to say, from the beginning, from our conversations on reimagining public safety to housing, development, this day already has been just chock full of amazing information. And hopefully the data necessary for us to think about what it looks like to create a vision in a city where we are thriving in the city of Oakland. And so thank you for that presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Tanya.